Good morning, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. It's a really, really beautiful day here in Portland, Oregon in Zone 8B. You can see behind me my Cecile Brunner rose in full bloom. There is a gate here that leads down to a raspberry patch and then to the chicken coop. There is a large hazel here, and in front of it is one of my hardy kiwis. This is the female, and obviously a rhubarb here. So my garden has lots of different permaculture design elements in it. I have areas that serve as a food forest design. I have a rain garden. I have rotational poultry paddocks. I have a little apiary for my honeybees. I have annual veggie beds, but there's one thing that's lacking in my garden that I want to talk about today, and that is the herb spiral. Now, if you're familiar at all with permaculture design, herb spirals are pretty ubiquitous in permaculture education and permaculture literature, right? They're a symbol that most people think of immediately when you start talking about permaculture. In fact, years ago in one of my workshops where I was talking about, urban permaculture design, one of the first questions I got from one of the students was, "Where's your herb spiral, Angela?" Like, where is it? It's such an important part of permaculture, but you don't have it in your garden. So I thought this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about herb spirals. Are they hype? Are they necessary? Are they a good part of a permaculture garden? So what is an herb spiral? You may see pictures of them in folks' permaculture gardens. They are essentially a form of raised bed planting, right? Where you are actually creating a spiral where the bed goes up and up in elevation. And they're very beautiful, symmetrical. They can maximize use of space because you're building up, and they create little tiny microclimates. So the traditional herb spiral is, something that you put in a sunny area of your garden, and you plant different herbs depending on the elevation and amount of sun that you have at that particular spot in the spiral. First off, let me say there are a number of symbols in permaculture. For me, in a temperate climate, it's definitely herb spirals. I think, again, ubiquitous no matter where you live. Herb spirals are presented as kind of like a mascot of permaculture. For me here in a temperate zone, it's also comfrey. It's also things like sunchokes. And, it's also things like having a worm bin. That can be kind of, elements that you include in your garden to kind of legitimize you as a permaculture person. That doesn't mean those things are necessary to do good permaculture. And as we're going to talk about here in a little bit, they may not be appropriate for every permaculture setting. And you can do real permaculture that is well designed without needing to include all of these kind of hallmarks that folks associate with us permies. Herb spirals are essentially a teaching tool, right? They are a scaled down lesson in all kinds of permaculture concepts: earthworks, microclimates, edge effect, harnessing the sun, drainage, selecting appropriate plants for your landscape, symmetry, using organic shapes, maximizing the edge, maximizing the amount of plantable space, using beauty in your design, observing and interacting with nature, and the list goes on and on and on and on. That is why herb spirals are so important, and why they are so useful, and why they are so omnipresent in permaculture teaching courses. In permaculture, we teach produce no waste. Herb spirals are a great way to reuse materials. You can use all kind of waste, things like urbanite, which I use all over my garden, which is essentially busted up concrete. You can use rocks that you dig from the site, slate, slabs, old bricks, to create that spiral. You're making a mini earthworks. Basically, you are creating the spiral, and then you're moving earth from other parts of your site in order to create this shape that you want to produce a desired effect in your landscape. Now, herb spirals can also be a form of hugelkultur. You can use dead and decaying wood to create your herb spiral, with the understanding that over time it will sink down as that wood decays. Light, drainage, and wind change as you move around the herb spiral. This means that you choose different herbs to satisfy different requirements of the spiral, right? You are essentially creating these little teeny tiny microclimates, and you're learning about the nuances in design and planting. you're learning that actually on this side of the spiral, it gets a half day of shade. And so I want to make sure that the plant that I have on this side can tolerate more shade than on the front side of the spiral. I noticed that at the top of the spiral, that has the least amount of water and the most drainage, right? So I want something that can endure a lot of sun and more of a Mediterranean kind of dry aspect at the top. Folks often put rosemary at the top, which then creates even more shade for the back side of your herb spiral. Some herb spirals have a worm tower in the middle, or a compost tower. That's essentially a cylinder of some kind of, metal mesh or other material where you are composting in situ. You are creating that fertility right in the middle of the spiral, and it goes all the way down through the middle. Worm towers work better in a warmer climate. I can't do vermicomposting in the ground where I am. They won't survive the winter, but I see folks in warmer climates utilizing that a lot. You also could just have a cylinder in the middle of your herb spiral where you stack up leaves that you rake up from the garden and essentially build leaf mold in the middle of your herb spiral. So that's through the center of the spiral. As you move back down to the base at the foot or the mouth of the spiral where it hits ground level, folks often do little ponds, little water features. And that is a way, again, to teach microclimates. You're looking at everything on a little scale. It's like a little scale model of what you can do with your garden. And it gets you thinking about, how do things change if I scale up to the size of my entire site? If you have that pond at the bottom of your herb spiral, you need to make sure that you have really good design, because herb spirals are usually put in full sun. How are you going to care for that pond in full sun so that it can thrive? So are herb spirals necessary? Well, I've been doing permaculture for 23 years now, and I don't have an herb spiral. I've never had an herb spiral. I have flirted with the idea, but it just doesn't work on my site with my design elements. I prefer to interplant most of my herbs in my different guilds around the garden, and then also my more Mediterranean herbs I put in full sun in drier parts of my garden. I have those climates, microclimates on my site that I've identified, and I want to use them as efficiently as possible. So I don't want to create other little microclimates in my garden. I'm going to use what's already there on a larger scale. So while an herb spiral design is something that can work really well in a small garden, because you are creating a raised bed and you are trying to use more vertical space, you may find, if you have a smaller garden like mine, that an herb spiral is not an efficient use of space and you would rather do something else with the sunny spots in your yard. That's totally okay. So is your herb spiral going to save the world? No. And I think a lot of people, rightly so, can criticize permaculture for being less efficacious than we would like it to be. But that's not the point of an herb spiral. An herb spiral is not meant to feed everybody. It's a teaching tool, as I said, that is meant to help us see in real time in our actual garden different design concepts within permaculture. You may find that you want to put an herb spiral in your garden because you have a small garden and that's how you want to use your herbs. That's where it works best for you. Perhaps in your zone 1 right out your back door, because culinary herbs are something you want to go snip right as you're cooking a meal and you don't want to have to trudge out to the back of the garden, right? You want them easily accessible. You may find it just doesn't work on your site, just like mine. You may find that there are other ways that you want to use sunny spots in your garden. That is totally okay. I talk a lot on this channel about not being dogmatic, not being puritanical in the way we design our garden, be it with natives, be it with permaculture darling plants. I talk about not being zealous in our eating habits, not being so constrained by our own ideology that we're missing a chance for resilience and greater sustainability. And I think that's very true with herb spirals. So if you don't have one in your garden, that's totally okay. It's totally, I promise you, you're still legit in permaculture if you choose not to have an herb spiral. And if there are lessons that you think an herb spiral could teach you, but you can't put one in where you are, there are gobs and gobs and gobs of blog posts on the internet with people explaining how they installed their herb spiral and what they learned. There's nothing wrong with learning by doing, but there's also nothing wrong with learning by reading what other people have done and saying, you know what, I learned that lesson and I don't need to repeat the experiment. In the end, the reason to do an herb spiral is so that you start to see things through a permaculture lens, so that the lessons that an herb spiral teaches you are ones that you can take and apply to the greater site. right? You can scale them up to your landscape. You can say, I'm trying something out small, slow, small solutions. We don't want to take big risks in permaculture. Maybe there's a lesson I can learn from my herb spiral and then expand that to my entire garden on a much greater scale. Being able to utilize design elements that are teaching tools is super important to be able to start to think in a resilience mindset, to think about how we can design from patterns to details, how we can observe and interact and be much more of a recipient of what the garden wants to teach us. And for that reason, an herb spiral may be a great choice for you. Maybe you need that teacher in the garden. Maybe you need that herb spiral to help you learn lessons and apply them. Maybe you just love the sheer beauty of the symmetry of that spiral in your garden and all of those herbs and their aromatics, perfuming your garden. Maybe that's something you really want just for the aesthetics. Maybe you just want it as a neat, organized little packet of a place to keep all of your culinary herbs. Maybe you have lessons that you are hoping it will teach you. For all of those reasons, an herb spiral may be a great choice. But also, again, don't have to have one. When we're looking at herb spirals and we're looking at anything in our permaculture garden, we want to know, how can this be increasing my resilience? How can this be something that reduces my workload, that teaches me lessons about sustainability, helps me become a more whole and centered and resilient human being with a more resilient and productive garden? If that's something that an herb spiral can augment for you in your garden, in your life, then go for it. I would love to hear about your experiences having an herb spiral in your garden if you've done it. If it's been a total dud that you've ripped out, I'd love to hear about it. If it's been great for you and really a wonderful teacher, I'd love to hear about that as well. So thank you for watching today. Please don't forget to click like and subscribe and check out all the ways you can support the work of this channel down below. Thanks.